Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. This is our live episode of the Legal Breakdown. So I know a lot of folks have questions that they wanted to answer. We do our daily episodes of the Legal Breakdown, but of course, hoping that we can get some audience participation here. So I would ask folks who are watching right now, who are streaming this, to throw some questions in the chat if you want Glenn and I to get into them. The first question, Glenn, that I'm hearing from quite a few people is, how does the 14th Amendment apply here? Because I know that we've heard from courts in California, in Colorado, that Donald Trump is an adjudicated insurrectionist. And so how does that not preclude him from being able to take office?
Yeah, Brian, great question. And this is my first live stream experience. So everybody, please be gentle with me. I don't really know what I'm doing, but Brian is in the driver's seat, so I'm feeling confident. Look, the 14th Amendment language could not be more clear, right? It says if you take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, which a president does, and you thereafter engage in insurrection or give aid and comfort to insurrectionists, you're disqualified. You can't serve in office, federal, state, or local. The only way you can serve in office is if 2/3 of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, votes to remove the disqualification, remove the disability. Now, we know Donald Trump is an adjudicated insurrectionist. There was a trial held out in Colorado, and the judge ruled after she heard from the witnesses that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. The Supreme Court of Colorado affirmed, agreed with that. Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. The Supreme Court said, well, you know, the 14th Amendment doesn't say an insurrectionist can't be on a primary ballot, so we're not going to let Colorado keep him off the primary ballot. To which I say, fair enough, it doesn't say that. But you know what it does say? He can't be sworn in as president. He can't hold office unless the Congress votes to remove that disqualification. That's the Constitution. And I expect, Brian, as we move toward January 6th, when it will be time to, certify the results of the presidential election, we're going to be hearing from constitutional scholars, both in and out of Congress, perhaps guys like Jamie Raskin, that we need to have a discussion about the 14th Amendment's disqualification and whether Donald Trump should be permitted to take the oath of office or not. I'm not pretending it's going to put a stop to Donald Trump being sworn in, but it's an open legal issue.
Glenn, let's see what other questions we can go into here. And I do agree that I think there's a difference between what the right thing to do is and what this Republican-controlled government will actually do. And I think it's important to take that into account and not kind of wish cast that just because it's laid out in the plain text of the Constitution, that means that the Republican Party, in whatever form they're in, whether it's the Supreme Court, the Senate, or the House, is gonna decide blindly one day that they're gonna defer the Constitution over Trump. That's clearly not the case. Moving over to some other questions here. One that I'm seeing repeated over and over is let's see. Do you have any? Do you believe that the House will opt to release the Senate report, the ethics report regarding Matt Gaetz, and is there any reason why it would be especially important to do so?
Yeah, great question. I think it's impossible for us to definitively answer the question, will it be released? Will we see the House ethics report against, involving Matt Gaetz, which I'm sure just includes a parade of horribles, misconduct, perhaps even criminal conduct. I think the House will fight releasing it. House Speaker Mike Johnson has already said he's not interested in releasing it, which is just sort of despicable, right? Transparency is what we need, particularly if this documents evidence of Matt Gaetz' misconduct and potential crimes. Matt Gaetz, who Donald Trump said, I think I'm going to make him Attorney General of the United States. We all have an interest and a need. The American people have a need to see what's in that ethics report. Now, Matt Gaetz tried to use a little sleight of hand saying, I'm resigning from Congress today, meaning that the House Ethics Committee loses jurisdiction over him and can't issue the report. I think that ploy is going to fail. Here's why. We've already heard Republican senators say, okay, Matt Gaetz might be the next Attorney General. We need to see the report. I think the senators will win out over the Mike Johnsons of the world. And I am hopeful. I'm hopeful one way or another that the Senate will see that report and that ultimately the American people will see that report.
Another question I'm getting is, what about Judge Merchan's upcoming sentencing? And that's for Donald Trump's New York trial, where he's right now awaiting sentencing for his 34 felony convictions. Will that impact Donald Trump being allowed to be sworn in?
It will not. No matter what happens, whether Donald Trump is sentenced on November 26th or not, that will not be an impediment to him being sworn in. Listen, our Constitution needs a little updating because it doesn't make any sense that a convicted felon can be president of the United States. But the Supreme Court has said if the Constitution doesn't say a convicted felon is prohibited, then a convicted felon is not prohibited. So here's the thing. I am actually fairly confident after 30 years of being a practicing federal prosecutor of how this one's going to play out. And it's not going to make anybody happy, but this is the way I see it. You know, the first thing Judge Merchan has to do is rule on a pending motion to dismiss the case entirely, throw all the guilty verdicts out because of the presidential immunity ruling handed down by the Supreme Court. I believe Judge Merchan is going to say, oh, hell no, I'm not throwing these guilty verdicts out because none of this involved presidential conduct or official presidential duties. But the minute, Brian, Judge Merchan refuses to dismiss the case, then the law suggests that that can be appealed right then, right there, not wait until after Donald Trump is sentenced. So I think this is going to bring everything to a screeching halt. Everything will be put on pause. And who knows when Donald Trump might be sentenced on his guilty verdicts.
Glenn, as a follow-up to that, is it possible that the New York court system can sit on these 34 felony convictions, the sentencing for these convictions, and just wait until January 21st at 1 p.m. when he's out of office to then say, okay, now we're going to go forward with sentencing?
You know, not only possible, but I would say it's even somewhat likely. Here's why I say that. Because the prevailing wisdom is if a state like Georgia, like New York, not the federal prosecutors, but if a state prosecutor is prosecuting a sitting president, that case has to be put on hold, on pause, until the president leaves power. So being as that is the way the system is designed to work, it could very well be that if Donald Trump's case is not dismissed by Judge Merchan or any intervening appellate court, it gets put on hold and Donald Trump gets sentenced the minute he leaves office. So whether that's January 20th of 2029 or if he leaves early, because who knows, he negotiates a little pardon from his vice president, J.D. Vance, and he tries to ride off into the sunset of Mar-a-Lago. Well, guess what? He can be sentenced at that moment.
Okay. Another question I'm getting is how can we prevent judge shopping so that baseless claims don't flood the courts and that claims that Republicans know that they can put forward don't go to the right judges who would be sympathetic to those claims?
Man, these are great questions, and I appreciate them because preventing judge shopping can be challenging. So let me tell you, in all my years as a prosecutor, I didn't get to judge shop. I never had an interest in judge shopping. Once I saw what judge was assigned, I was like, oof, that's not great for me. Or I'd be like, great, this is a terrific judge. But we don't get to judge shop. But what we know the Republicans have tried to do is take issues that they think the Supreme Court might be interested in, like mifepristone, or maybe just tanking women's constitutional privacy rights altogether. And then they would try to position it to be picked up by a Trump-appointed judge that they knew really didn't have a whole lot of allegiance to the law or the Constitution. And the Republicans were somewhat successful in that. But here's what I want everybody to hold. So listen, you can try to guard against judge shopping, but it can be challenging. But here's what I want everybody to hold fast to. The next couple of years, Donald Trump will try to make lots of unlawful and unconstitutional moves. And where will those be challenged? They will be challenged in the federal trial courts all across the country. And let me tell you, Brian, the federal judges are ready to stand as a bulwark against Donald Trump's unlawful attempts to undermine our rights. So, we have a lot of legal battles coming, but I actually feel pretty bullish about the trial courts, the federal trial court judges holding fast.
Another question we got is, how can a convicted felon get security clearance?
Can't. Donald Trump could not be hired as a file clerk in the federal government. So what is Donald Trump trying to do? Because it looks like he's going to try to populate his government with, criminals, criminal associates, co-defendants, co-conspirators, cruddy people of all stripe. He's trying to rig the system so that they can do away with FBI background checks, which is a special kind of insanity and extremely dangerous, because I've been through so many background checks, both by the Department of Justice when I was a federal prosecutor and the Department of Defense when I was an Army JAG prosecutor starting back in the 80s. And the reason we do background investigations is because we don't want our government employees susceptible to blackmail or compromise by foreign governments. And if you do away with those safeguards, we are in deep, deep trouble on the national security front.
Glenn, what could be done legally if Donald Trump uses the National Guard, for example, or the military more broadly, or the National Guard from red states, for example, to round up illegal immigrants in blue states? Like, can you talk about where jurisdiction of one begins and ends? What can be done? Whether the supremacy clause applies here? Because there's going to be some struggle between Donald Trump sending in ICE agents or potentially National Guardsmen into states where those own states' National Guards probably are going to be following orders from the governor not to cooperate with these states. So we're in a little bit of an impending, like a simmering pot here.
Yeah, there's a lot of gray and not a lot of black and white when it comes to these jurisdictional breakdowns. But let's start with some of the hard and fast principles. First of all, the U.S. military cannot be used to enforce domestic law. That's called the Posse Comitatus Act. Can't be done unless you just decide to do everything unlawful in violation of the Constitution. But first of all, and I'll get to the National Guard piece, but if Donald Trump listen, this is why Donald Trump is trying to purge the military of good, honorable generals, right? He wants lapdogs and loyalists. He doesn't want generals who will be loyal to the Constitution. He wants generals who will be loyal to him. But let me tell you, I went to Army basic training, and then I went to Army law school after I got my law degree. And they drill this into our heads. You are duty bound to obey lawful orders, but more importantly, you must disobey unlawful orders. So if Donald Trump starts ordering the military to do things that are plainly unlawful, like wade into the immigration issue and enforce the domestic laws of our nation, I still believe that the good men and women of the military will decline, will refuse to do it. As the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, said, we do not take an oath to a dictator or a tyrant or one man. We take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. That is what the vast majority of people in the military will let guide them. So, but, the National Guard piece, the governors are typically in charge of directing the National Guard and its efforts. So, there is a lot of gray area between, okay, what can the federal government, what can the president tell governors to do? I think it will come down, Brian, to the loyalty of the governors to the law and the Constitution rather than their loyalty to Donald Trump. And I've been so heartened in recent days watching governor after governor and attorney general after attorney general from the states stand up and say, we're going to be a bulwark against Donald Trump's lawlessness as it impacts our state if he tries to do it. And let me finish with this. I'm long-winded. Cut me off when you want. Even Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger down in Georgia, Republican governor and Republican attorney general in Georgia, said what to Donald Trump when he said, just give me 11,780 votes and corruptly declare me the winner? Those Republicans stood up and said, no. And I still believe there are Republican governors and state attorneys general who will say no to Donald Trump's lawless asks.
Okay, one quick question here. Let's say that Donald Trump, as the commander-in-chief or one of his lackeys that he installs, issues an order, but the order is unconstitutional. The order is illegal. Where do the soldiers defer? Because they've gotten an order from a superior, and their job is to obey, but at the same time, they also swear an oath to the Constitution. And so what's the immediate response from these people?
You know, it's so hard because as an Army prosecutor, I sometimes had to confront the issue of a soldier who disobeyed an order that he or she believed was unlawful. I had to make the right call about whether that soldier got it right or got it wrong because a court martial was hanging in the balance. These are difficult decisions for soldiers to make. But the good news is the people who are going to be put in a position by Donald Trump to make these decisions are the 1, 2, 3, and 4-star generals. They are up to the task. So, you know, what you are responsible, each soldier or sailor or Marine or, Coast Guardsman is responsible for themselves, whether they are going to obey an order or not. They have to make their best judgment whether it's lawful or not lawful. If they're wrong, they may be court-martialed. If they're right, then the people who gave the unlawful orders may be court-martialed. These are not easy or intuitive decisions. They are hard, but they are very consequential.
I'm getting a question here. What if Donald Trump enacts martial law? So can you explain what martial law is and then what the implications would be if he enacts it?
Yeah, martial law, like, for example, if all of a sudden our country is under attack from a foreign hostile actor, it gives the president the ability to suspend lots and lots of our rights and put down an armed resistance that is attacking the United States. So, I haven't read up on martial law recently, but I think Donald Trump would be hard pressed to successfully invoke martial law, because what I know is that, there will be a flood. Do you know how many legal organizations, good, upstanding legal organizations, we have preparing to file legal challenges to every single potentially unlawful or unconstitutional act undertaken by the Trump administration? And let me tell you, I heard one of the state attorney generals say that in the first Trump administration, there were 80% of the lawsuits there that were filed trying to combat lawless acts by Donald Trump. 80% were successful in knocking him down. So he tries to invoke martial law. You're going to see a flood of lawsuits. And let me just finish with this, even though I don't really enjoy highlighting this piece of it. The courts will sometimes say if a president does something, it is a political act, and it enjoys what we call political act doctrine immunity, meaning if it's purely a political act, the courts have no right or jurisdiction to wade into it. I don't know if martial law would be viewed as a political act that the courts wouldn't touch, but I think that's something we have to keep in the back of our minds.
Glenn, can the Supreme Court reverse their decision on Donald Trump's immunity or presidential immunity if they realize that he's abusing his authority and violating the Constitution?
A great question, because I don't know that there is actually a legal procedure on the books that would allow the Supreme Court to say, you know what, even though the time frame for revisiting one of our rulings, that's called a petition for reconsideration, has expired, and no party, no prosecutor, no defense attorney has asked us to reconsider it, we're just going to do it on our own and make up the procedure that allows us to do it. So the answer to the question is, I don't think there is an existing procedure on the books that allows it. However, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court, and because there's no appeal from the Supreme Court, they could make it up out of whole cloth, their ability to revisit a legal ruling, just like they made the legal ruling up out of whole cloth in the first instance of presidential immunity. So if they wanted to do it, they're going to do anything they want to do.
Okay, let's move over to, can RFK Jr. do all of the things that he has threatened to do with regard to vaccines and whatnot without oversight from the medical community? This might be a little bit out of your area of expertise.
Way out of my wheelhouse, but I've been trying to listen to the authorities on how much power an agency head has over the agency he runs and the policies that it tries to enact. And I have a feeling, he may have high hopes of doing goodness knows what to the American people that he believes in. I mean, I know he was nominated to be the head of Health and Human Services. Maybe his first act will be to change it, change the name to the Department of Brainworms and Bear Claws. I have no idea. Yeah. But I think he is going to be met with so much legitimate resistance. What do I mean by legitimate resistance? These agencies are like awash in regulations that they are required to follow. Some are courtesy of congressional laws directing how that agency can do business. Some are just the internal policies and procedures the agency has adopted over the decades. And what I am confident and what I'm comfortable saying, Brian, is Kennedy is not going to be able to ride in and do things that are dramatically damaging to the health of the American people and the public without meeting lots of resistance, legitimate resistance. I don't mean let's all be the resistance and oppose everything Trump and his administration does. Legitimate resistance from within. And I have a feeling he's going to have a hard time doing much of what he might want to do.
How can Democrats use the overturning of Chevron to fight against Donald Trump's departments? Like, for example, is it possible that Democrats could judge shop to get favorable results because, that would in effect allow us to confer power to judges and not the department head's expertise, and we can get injunctions that way?
Yeah, great question. So I'll take the Chevron piece on in a second, but I want to circle back to judge shopping because even though judge shopping is something that from an old prosecutor's perspective makes me recoil, kind of like pardons make me recoil because they most often seem to be deep injustices when pardons are delivered. But the flip side of judge shopping is there are some issues that are of national interest and import such that those issues might properly be brought in front of judges in any of the 50 states, in any of the 13 federal jurisdictions. It's a kind of judge shopping, but it is the kind of judge shopping that is not offensive to the law if a particular case can legitimately be brought in any jurisdiction before any federal judge. So the Chevron doctrine, which essentially says judges no longer really need to defer or take into serious consideration the opinions of experts from the government in, science, in math, in climate, in technology, in which I think it was a poor decision because guess what? Judges are not experts in all of those things. Judges have facts presented to them. They apply the law that exists to those facts and they try to reach supportable decisions. They're not subject matter experts in the litigation that is being, handled before them. So, when you ask the question, well, can the Democrats exploit or use to their advantage the death of Chevron deference? The answer is maybe, but I think judges, particularly honest and honorable judges, whether appointed by Democrat presidents or Republicans, are not going to take advantage of the fact that the death of the Chevron doctrine now might give them a little bit more freedom and leeway in making their decisions. So ultimately, I don't think that's going to be a real bonus to the Democrats.
Cut to the second Judge Cannon gets something in front of her. She's going to be the world's next foremost expert on energy exploration or drilling or wildlife, whatever comes in front of her. You just watch. You say that normal judges aren't willing to make themselves the arbiters of all things, of all things that they can be experts on, but people like Judge Cannon in a heartbeat if it helps them politically. I'm getting the question regarding due process for undocumented immigrants. What are their rights? What does the court process look like? What's the life of the detainees look like while waiting for possible justice or release?
Yeah, my wife until recently was a career immigration lawyer, so I'm not really steeped in immigration law, but I do kind of know what some of the consequences are when the United States has decided it wants to engage in mass deportation. I mean, people who come here certainly lawfully have rights. If you're seeking asylum, for example, if you're fleeing from a state that is persecuting you or your family. And, generally the courts are pretty good about honoring those rights, but who knows what we have in store, in Trump, the sequel, when it comes to family separation, mass deportation. So if they want to do it properly, I look back to one of the mass deportation efforts from the first Trump administration. Now, I'm going to set aside the cruel family separation policies that they, either put in place or that they just sort of ran without even having legitimate policies in place. But, there was a resurfacing of some reporting that in the first Trump administration, they engaged in this massive plan to do workplace raids to try to find folks who are undocumented and start the deportation process. And they spent 15 months, they being the federal government, the authorities responsible for immigration and deportation. They spent 15 months preparing for this massive roundup, right, to try to get at the illegal immigrant problem. And when they actually put the plan into effect, they netted, I believe, 104, I may have the exact number wrong, undocumented folks. And it then took something like, many, many, many months for any of this to come to fruition. And it cost us like tens of millions of dollars to ultimately deport, after a couple of years, 104 people. So this notion that we're going to deport 100 million or 10 million or 20 million, undocumented folks is pure folly. This is all just designed to terrorize populations, maybe into not coming here in the first place. But here's what I will also, let me end with this, because once these cases move into the courts, judges take pretty damn seriously the rights of anybody who the United States is proceeding against in deportation proceedings or otherwise. And they will honor and respect those rights, and they will make sure the folks are being humanely treated. That is once the courts get involved. Now, if the Trump administration wants to try to cut the courts out altogether and just massively ship people, back to their home countries or over the border, that's the kind of illegality, massive illegality, that you're going to have groups like the ACLU and other civil liberties organizations who, I promise you, are gearing up to bring hundreds or thousands of court challenges. And I say, bring it on.
Also, I should note that on this point of Trump not being able to do the things that he promises to do, he did the same thing where he came into office in 2016 by saying that he was going to build a wall. And instead of building, 3,000 miles of wall, how long is our border? 3,000 miles, roughly? Yeah. He built 52 miles of wall. That's what all of this, and of course, when he says he built the wall anyway, and when right-wing media dutifully repeats it, that's all that matters to these people. If you ask 100 Trump supporters, 99 of them are going to tell you that, yeah, he built we have wall, across the entire southern border. And at the end of the day, that's what it's really about. It's not about doing it so much as it's about patting himself on the back for thinking that he does it or manipulating people into thinking that he did it. So
Brian, let me follow
a
up
big
on
portion of that.
Because this is a point of light, and this is something that I think we can hold on to as giving us realistic hope, right? Not hopey. I'm not being Pollyanna, and I've probably stolen this from you, so I'll give you credit for it. When people are now looking at the prospect of a Republican-controlled White House, a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, a Republican-controlled Senate, we think, oh my God, what is he going to be able to do to us? How is he going to be able to victimize the American people? When he had that for 2 years, as you just said, he had promised that he was going to build a wall and Mexico was going to pay for it. Nope. He promised that he would repeal and replace, or at least repeal, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. He couldn't even do that. And that was his marquee promise, right? So he said there's going to be infrastructure. He said, and he failed at everything really but for tax cuts for billionaires. So maybe we've got more tax cuts for billionaires and everybody else will suffer and struggle as a result of those tax cuts. But let's take some comfort in the fact that last time he had these same pieces in play, working to his advantage, at his disposal, he effed it all up. And you know what? I think the Republicans in the Senate are already in dissension and disarray over something as basic as who he's going to nominate for Attorney General. That is a good sign.
Which brings me to the next question. I'm sure you can guess this one, and that is, what is the likelihood, in your opinion, of Matt Gaetz getting approved?
I think the likelihood is low for a couple of reasons. One, he's a petty criminal, not the right stuff of an American attorney general. I think the pushback that you're already seeing from some of the Republican senators, and certainly from folks in the House who know Matt Gaetz and have been saying, this guy, has no right being in control of anything. I think that is a good sign for the prospects of his confirmation being low. I also think it's a good sign that Donald Trump wanted Senator Rick Scott as the Senate Majority Leader, and the Republicans just sort of soundly rejected that, slapped him down, and appointed John Thune. Maybe, again, not the best candidate in the world, but better than Rick Scott, at least in my uninformed opinion on the political front. So I don't think, and I also think this may have just been Donald Trump trying to help give Matt Gaetz cover for saying, oh, I have to resign right now because Donald Trump said he's going to nominate me as Attorney General. And because I resign right now, the House Ethics Committee loses the ability to disclose
How lucky.
House Ethics report. Listen, Rubio was nominated to a cabinet position. He didn't say, I have to resign right now. Stefanik was just nominated, named to a position in the administration. She didn't say, I have to resign right now. This whole thing feels like a game to me. And at the end of the day, I don't even know that when confirmation hearings roll around, Matt Gaetz will be the one that is, being considered to be Attorney General.
I should also add that there is the possibility that Matt Gaetz's effort to use the AG nomination as a pretense to resign might backfire, because now that he is resigned, because he's just that certain that he's going to become the next Attorney General, now he's going to have to sit through vetting with the AG nomination, and they're going to want to see the thing that Matt Gaetz just resigned from Congress to prevent from being exposed. And so now, if there wasn't already attention on this thing at the prospect of it being released, now there's going to be even more attention, because a hit dog will holler, right? If Matt Gaetz resigns because he's just that worried about what this report is going to show, and we have reporting right now that says it was highly damaging, then that's going to be even more reason why these senators who are going to be going through their constitutional duty of advice and consent are going to have to look through this to make sure that there is maybe not a reason why someone who is being investigated for sexual misconduct for a minor shouldn't be in charge of the entire Justice Department.
Yeah, this game of musical chairs is likely to stop. The music is going to stop, and there ain't going to be a chair for Matt Gaetz to sit in.
I'm getting this question: are there ways to protect Social Security from this administration?
I don't know. That's so far beyond my area of expertise. I think Donald Trump, if given free rein, can gut Social Security. I just hope. I mean, look at how old some of these dang senators are. I hope that they understand that they will be doing such serious, and I use this word advisedly, deadly damage to their own constituents if they gut Social Security, because frankly, that is what so many seniors live on. But the legal ins and outs, I don't pretend to be an expert on. I do know if Trump tries to gut Social Security in a way that violates the law, well, bring it on, because there are going to be more lawsuits filed challenging that. And once those lawsuits are filed, Brian, what happens is usually the court will issue some kind of a temporary injunction to freeze everything so that nothing can change while the cases work their way through the courts. And what we know, because Donald Trump is the master of delay, these things can be bogged down in the courts for years. So I am hopeful that he will not be able to gratuitously hurt seniors.
Do we think Congress will agree to take recess so that Trump can have his appointees be temporary in their acting positions for 2-year terms?
Brian, I think you and I might have different takes on this question. I think, one, the election of Thune and rejecting Donald Trump's call to have Rick Scott be the Senate Majority Leader is a good data point that maybe they will not just go into recess so Donald Trump can cram all of these unqualified nominees down the throats of the American people.
In effect, agreeing to take recess appointments, which would give Donald Trump the ability to name these people to acting positions who again can stay there for 2 years. That is in effect a vote to confirm not Nikki Haley, Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Gaetz. That is a vote. That is an affirmative vote in favor of these people.
Yeah, it will be the Senate completely abdicating their responsibility to their own constituents to try to make sure that these nominees are not going to really destroy our national security, completely destroy our law enforcement apparatus at the Department of Justice. So, and what have we already seen? How many senators have talked about how they're looking forward to the Senate confirmation hearing for somebody like Matt Gaetz because they have grave concerns? Every time they say that, I hear, so Donald Trump, we're going to have confirmation hearings. We're not going to go out of session. And here's if they try to go out of session as part of what I would call a constitutional conspiracy to try to avoid the advice and consent responsibilities of the Senate, don't be surprised if you see lawsuits, because the Supreme Court has never ruled that you can enter into this dirty quid pro quo agreement, the Senate and the president, to avoid advice and consent. That it's not a done deal, that even if they try to do it, they'll be successful legally.
If Matt Gaetz is confirmed, how broadly outside his scope of duties can he venture?
Well, if he is the attorney general, he could venture, put it this way, he could commit federal crimes, which would be outside the scope of the official duties of an attorney general. Let me go on record as saying that, committing of crimes. And then he could tell his department officials and the FBI, no, you're not going to investigate me for my federal crimes. So he will be largely unconstrained because, one, he'll have a president who has been told by the Supreme Court that he can commit all the crimes he wants against the American people. He'll have an attorney general who will kind of de facto be in a similar situation with nobody who can bring him to heel and prosecute him for his crimes. So he can do pretty much whatever he damn well pleases. Another good reason that you can't have, a lawless petty criminal as attorney general.
Is the premise of firing Schedule F career civil servants, is that a pipe dream for Trump, or is there actually a legal pathway for him to be able to turn these career civil servants into political appointees?
I fear he can do, and he may be able to do it with an executive order. What I also know, and I'm going to sound like, I keep going to the same refrain because it's important and valuable, is if he starts to go after federal employees who have rights, by the way, you're going to have every federal employee file a lawsuit. There are teams of lawyers being put together in D.C. right now, prepared to meet the force of Trump's lawlessness as it is deployed against federal government employees. And whether that is playing with Schedule F and doing things that the law may not allow, there's only one way to find out. One, how does Donald Trump try to implement it? And two, what do the courts say about how Donald Trump has tried to implement it? And then the other thing that they're gearing up for is any vindictive prosecutions of Donald Trump's enemies that might come. And I don't think he's going to go after 10,000 people, but I do think he will pick one or two or three marquee enemies, maybe Jack Smith, maybe Tish James, maybe even Joe Biden, and try to go down the path of a vindictive prosecution. And let me lay everybody's mind at ease. The federal bench will not stand for it. To a judge, I can tell you they're not going to stand for it.
Glenn, let's see. By the way, I know these questions will come until the end of time. So whenever you have to go, I think we might be coming up to that time soon. So you just let me know how many questions you're able to take.
How long have we been at it, Brian?
We've been at it for over 45 minutes, about 45 minutes now.
All right, let's shoot for an hour.
Okay. All right. So we got 15 minutes left. Make sure to tag me in the chat if you are asking questions right now so I can see them more easily. Let's see. What remedies, if any, are there to Republican control of the Supreme Court, with Donald Trump appointing at least two more, if not more, justices this term? And I think that's an allusion to being able to replace appointments for, or appoint replacements for Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. It seems like the court will be gone for the rest of my lifetime.
Yeah, this is one where I have to be honest. I can't find many points of light that pierce the darkness. And that is true for a couple of reasons. One, as you say, so first of all, here's my take on Clarence Thomas. He's got 3 more years to serve, and then he will be the longest serving Supreme Court justice ever. Let me tell you, Clarence Thomas thinks very highly of Clarence Thomas, and he wants that distinction. I believe that will keep him on the bench for at least the next 3 years. Alito, I have heard rumblings, ain't going anywhere because Alito is all about Alito. I mean, this is a guy who doesn't even have autonomy over his own flagpole, for God's sakes. So I don't know that Trump will necessarily get to replace those two. But here is what I also hear rumblings about. He is going to do what? He's going to increase the number of Supreme Court justices so he can pack the court with even more right-wing ideologues. He may be able to push that through Congress. That would take a change in the federal law, but he's got control of both houses. So I don't have a lot of hope that there will be.
I would note though that a law like that would require 60 votes in the Senate. So they don't have 60 votes in the Senate, but they could then opt to eliminate the filibuster, which would allow them to pass legislation with 51 votes. Of course, that would also pose a problem in the future because with 51 votes, that means that if the Democrats take control, that means that we can pass a Voting Rights Act. That means we can codify Roe v. Wade. That means that we can codify, that we can pass a law banning assault rifles in this country. So I think Republicans see it as a slippery slope, and knowing that they want to entrench the status quo and prevent progress, I think they would be more inclined to keep the filibuster in place, knowing that the benefits that they would derive from there being no filibuster would still be outweighed by what the Democrats would be able to do if they had no filibuster.
Yeah, all great points. And I don't think there is much hope that, for example, we'll get a mandatory code of ethics put in place anytime soon, certainly not with the Republicans in control, and that it's always received considerable pushback from the Supreme Court. It doesn't make sense to me that everybody in the federal government is laboring under, ethics restrictions and rules and mandatory, regulations. But for those 9 justices who get to, operate in an ethics-free zone, that's lunacy. That's the stuff of banana republics. I also don't think term limits will make a showing unless and until the Democrats come back into control in Washington. So I don't see a lot of hope and optimism for the future of the Supreme Court. Now, let me tell you, part of the reason we're here, in my opinion, is because the Department of Justice and Congress opted not to go hard after the corruption on the court when it was right there out in public for all to see. Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito lining their own pockets with money from rich Republican donors who either directly or indirectly had business in front of the court. That could have been the subject of possible impeachment investigations in Congress. It could have been the subject of criminal investigations at the Department of Justice. But Brian, we don't seem to ever be willing to learn our lesson that if you keep letting the ruling class criminals run rampant without accountability, then you're encouraging tomorrow's ruling class criminals to do the same thing and maybe even up the ante. I've been screaming about this forever, and I hope someday we learn from the mistakes of our past.
What if Donald Trump signs an executive order directing courts to dismiss all lawsuits against the federal government? And so I think I want to expand this question because obviously I think your answer is going to be that he can't just sign an executive order directing courts to dismiss all lawsuits against the federal government, but he is going to try and exploit our existing processes, to fit the mold of what he wants to do and all of the extrajudicial actions that he's trying to take. And so how do you think about that?
So here's how I think about that. He can tell his Department of Justice to take any position he wants them to take in federal court. What he can't do is direct the judiciary, now setting aside that he's got the corrupt 6 justices atop the federal judiciary. He cannot, there's a separation of powers issue. He cannot direct the judiciary to dismiss cases, and they're not going to dismiss cases. Here's the thing. Remember when, and I also want to talk about the scope of executive orders more broadly, but remember when Bill Barr had his federal prosecutors sort of corruptly try to dismiss Mike Flynn's case? Yeah. What did Judge Emmett Sullivan do? He said, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. When a prosecutor moves to dismiss a case, it can only be dismissed, quote, with leave of court. In other words, the judge has to approve the dismissal. Now, ultimately, after a long, drawn-out battle, Judge Sullivan believed he had nowhere else to go, and he had to allow the case to be dismissed. But no, the executive branch cannot tell the judicial branch to dismiss cases or to act in any way. Executive orders, you can't, you have to do certain things with legislation, but executive orders can allow a president to do certain other things. But every single executive order issued by a president can be attacked in court. That's not a political question. Do you know it took 4 tries to get the hateful Muslim ban passed? He did it once, they fought it in court, and it fell. Twice, and it fell in court. 3rd time, fell in court. 4th time. You know what? That's why I say, Brian, let's assert the rule of law by bringing these legal challenges to put a stop to every unlawful thing Donald Trump tries to do by executive order, because they can and will be challenged in court.
Someone expressed worry about Donald Trump dismissing 3- and 4-star generals in the military. Can that be stopped, or does he have full prerogative to be able to do that?
I don't know the president's authority to dismiss generals from the military without cause. Now, he did weigh in on some military cases when that war criminal, whose name will probably not come to mind, was court-martialed, and he basically overrode the court-martial and had him reinstalled as I don't want to get his title wrong. So yes, I do think the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the president, has a pretty wide berth to be able to impact those kind of decisions. What I don't think he can do, and I could be wrong about this because I'm not an expert on these military procedures, I think he can perhaps get people demoted or take them out of positions that they're presently in. What I don't think he can do is simply pull them out of the military, basically say you're fired without cause. So I think it's a gray area, and I'm not an expert on it. I think he's making lots of threats, and I think he will end up successfully following through on relatively few of those threats as it comes to his determination to get rid of, quote, woke generals. I think he will fail by and large.
Is the Trump administration able to overturn student loans that have been discharged or forgiven by the Biden-Harris administration due to illegal actions, for example, by scam colleges?
Yeah, well, when it comes to illegal action by scam colleges, yes, the federal government could, if it were so inclined in a legitimate Department of Justice, go after scam colleges. But I think that the courts have pretty consistently ruled against Joe Biden's efforts to try to cancel student loans.
I'm saying for the ones that have been for the student loans that have been forgiven or discharged, is Donald Trump would he be able to basically reinstate the loans that have already been forgiven?
So here's another principle. Even if you disagree with something a prior president or administration does, people have rights that vest in them once the federal government acts in a certain way. So what those students would be able to do if they had the federal government cancel their or modify their loans, I think the courts would look with disfavor on Donald Trump trying to come in and penalize those people by going against what the prior administration had done. And there are other analogous examples of that. So again, this is kind of way out of my wheelhouse because I was a criminal prosecutor my whole life. But I think students would have strong lawsuits to bring if they were harmed after rights had been vested in them by virtue of what an earlier administration did to their benefit.
Okay. And let's see, I think we have time for one more question while we've got Glenn here. So here's a good question. I think that is right in your wheelhouse, Glenn. Is there a limit to the immunity case? So is there a limit to what Donald Trump can do with regard to his newfound presidential immunity?
Yeah, what a great question to end on. The answer is yes. There are limits to presidential immunity, even as set out in the case of Trump versus United States, where the Supreme Court said, listen, a president has absolute immunity for anything he does that is considered a core constitutional power that a president gets. He has immunity for official acts, even though he has presumptive immunity. In other words, we will presume he has immunity for an official act unless you litigate the issue and a judge rules that no, the presumption of immunity is overcome by the lawlessness of the act. That's the middle ground. For acts that are not deemed presidential acts, like the acts of a candidate, like what Donald Trump was doing on and around January 6th to try to retain power, no immunity. So there are limits. Even in that horrific Supreme Court ruling, there are limits. Here is where the challenge comes in, though. The one who will ultimately decide where those limits are is the Supreme Court. And the most horrific line, I hate to end on this because this keeps me up at night. The most horrific line in the Supreme Court ruling regarding presidential immunity is a president will have presumptive immunity for all official acts, at least presumptive immunity. In other words, unless in the future we, the Supreme Court, decides he needs even more immunity, like absolute immunity for official acts. That scares me, and it's poor constitutional law because they're not even setting out the final and definitive rule for everybody to rely on and act according to. They're saying we might give Donald Trump even more immunity in the future if we think he needs it. That's frightening.
Okay, well, appreciate all your time here. Thank you to everybody who is watching right now and who's gave us these questions. These are excellent questions for the last hour here. If you want to hear more from Glenn, you can go to YouTube and type in Glenn Kirshner, Glenn, and follow him on his YouTube channel. You can also follow my YouTube channel if you're not yet subscribed, and this way you can watch our Legal Breakdown series. And of course, depending on where you're watching right now, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Twitch, whether it's on Facebook, thank you on all the platforms. I've tried to pick questions from every platform as we've been going along here, but I think all of this underscores why it is so important to stay in this fight moving forward, because we're definitely entering a period of uncertainty here. And look, people in the public sphere are going to be the bulwark against what Donald Trump is going to be able to do. Do not forget that the reason that we have the ACA, Obamacare, as it exists today, is because even from the minority, people in the country were able to wage a pressure campaign that stopped someone like John McCain for voting to repeal the ACA. So don't undermine the amount of power that we have. I know that folks might feel exhausted, but it is important to stay in this fight, and we'll be here every step of the way trying to answer whatever questions we can. So again, thank you all for taking the time. Glenn, thank you for joining me here and dealing with this barrage of questions on every single topic under the sun. But I appreciate everybody watching, and we'll do this again. Thanks, everybody.